Two brothers bought an old crane to save their company, but when they opened up the engine, they realized it wasn't just a piece of machinery. The next day, government officials showed up at their base. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and the yard outside the Harper Brothers' workshop had turned into a field of mud. The water pooled around the tires of rusting trucks and half-disassembled bulldozers, glimmering faintly under the low light that spilled through the cracked doors of the hangar. Inside, the air smelled of oil, damp concrete, and defeat. Andy Harper sat at a workbench that had once been crowded with blueprints and schedules, now covered only with unpaid invoices. His younger brother, Ray, stood near the entrance, smoking in silence, his reflection faint in the steel of an idle excavator. They had spent 20 years building a company that could stand against the larger names in the region, and now all that remained was the echo of machines that hadn't run in months. The recession had swept through the county like a cold wind, freezing construction projects mid-frame. Clients vanished, contracts dissolved, and the Harper Construction logo faded on half-built foundations scattered across the state. Their last major job, a logistics park near the river, had drained their savings. The developer fled the country when the financing collapsed, leaving them with unpaid wages, unfinished concrete, and a lawsuit that would outlast the winter. Andy had tried to negotiate extensions, to plead with suppliers, but numbers didn't listen to words. Equipment repossession notices came one after another until there was almost nothing left that bore their name. The company that had once employed 50 men was now just the two of them and an old dog that slept under the fuel drums. That night, Andy sat staring at the old ledger book, its corners curled with grease and dust. Every line in it told the same story, expenses that no income could cover. Ray finally spoke, his voice flat. "It's over, Andy. We sell what's left and walk away." But Andy shook his head slowly. Something in him refused to surrender to silence. They had spent their lives inside engines and steel, fixing what other men threw away. Maybe, he thought, that was still their only way forward. "We can sell the new rigs," he said quietly. "Buy older ones, cheap. The kind everyone's scrapping. We can fix them ourselves." Ray laughed once without humor. "You think we can rebuild an empire out of junk?" "Not an empire," Andy replied. "Just a start." Within a week, the plan became action. The brand new crane they'd bought on credit was sold to cover debts. The excavator followed. In their place came listings from government auctions, obsolete equipment, abandoned after projects shut down. Andy spent nights reading mechanical forums, searching for anything that still had a working engine block. What they could not afford in money, he meant to replace with skill. They had both been mechanics before they were builders. The scent of fuel and metal was older to them than the sound of concrete mixers. "If it has a motor," Andy told his brother, "we can make it run." In late spring, they drove to an auction yard outside Dayton. The rows of machinery stood like a graveyard of American industry. Faded yellow paint, broken lights, and numbers scrawled in chalk across windshields. Andy's eyes settled on a huge mobile crane sitting at the far end of the lot, a relic from the 1970s. Its frame was sturdy, its cab dented but intact, its boom folded like a tired arm. The label on the side read, Grove RT58. The auctioneer mentioned it casually, as if it were scrap metal. It had been decommissioned from a government contractor years ago, stored after a fire incident, then forgotten. No one else bid. Andy raised his hand. The hammer fell, and with that sound, something new began. The drive home was long. Rain turned to fog, and the old crane looked ghostly in the headlights of the towing truck. Ray dozed in the passenger seat, while Andy kept glancing at the machine through the mirror. There was something about it, a feeling that it carried stories within its rust. At dawn, they arrived at their workshop and backed it under the corrugated roof that still bore their faded company name. The crane dwarfed the building, its tires sinking slightly into the mud. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The rain drummed softly on metal, and the air smelled of diesel and wet dust. Andy touched the side panel near the cabin. The steel felt cold, but solid. Beneath the grime, he could see spots where the paint was newer. A lighter shade of yellow brushed over older rust. Someone had worked here more recently than the machine's age should allow. They spent the day inspecting it. Ray replaced a battery, connected a fuel line, and cursed when the starter refused to turn. The engine was locked solid. "Seized up," he said. Andy crouched beside him, tracing the bolts with his hand. The heads of several were new, bright steel in a sea of oxidation. He frowned. The identification plate on the block had been reattached with mismatched screws. That was not normal. Machines told their own stories if one knew how to read them, and this one was whispering secrets. "Someone's been inside this engine," Andy said. Ray shrugged. Maybe they tried to fix it. Or maybe they hid something. As evening settled, the workshop filled with shadows. They left the doors open for the light, and the last orange rays of the sun caught the dust in the air, turning it to gold. Andy wrote notes in his small, grease-stained notebook. Engine replaced. Bolts new. Paint too clean. Investigate under cab panel. The habit came from years of documenting every repair, but this time the notes felt more like clues in a mystery. He cleaned his hands with a rag, looked once more at the crane, and wondered what kind of man had owned it before them. The name Dawson Construction was still faintly visible under the grime. It sounded familiar, but he couldn't remember from where. That night he couldn't sleep. The sound of rain on the tin roof became the rhythm of his thoughts. Somewhere in the darkness outside, the crane stood like a sleeping giant. He imagined its massive diesel heart silent for decades, waiting for a reason to start again. The workshop clock ticked past midnight. Andy turned on a small desk lamp and stared at the photographs he'd taken earlier with his phone. The welding seams near the crankcase, the uneven coloring of the metal, the scratched serial numbers. He zoomed in on one picture. The weld line wasn't factory smooth, but done by hand, precise yet modern. Whoever repaired it had skill and access to professional tools. There was no record of that in the crane's maintenance logs. The discovery itched in his mind like a splinter. At dawn, Andy went back to the workshop. The air was cold and smelled of wet earth. Ray was already there, sipping coffee from a thermos, his expression unreadable. They stood for a while in silence, listening to the faint creak of metal cooling in the morning air. Andy finally said, "We'll open it tomorrow. The side panel. I want to see what's under there." Ray looked at him and nodded slowly. "If it gets this thing running, fine. But if you're chasing ghosts, don't drag me into it." Andy smiled faintly. "You've been chasing ghosts with me since we were kids." The day passed with small repairs, tightening cables, checking hydraulics, replacing filters. But Andy's attention kept drifting to the cab. The side panel under the driver's seat looked different from the others, slightly misaligned, as if removed and replaced in haste. He ran his hand over it again and felt a faint vibration under the steel, maybe the echo of his own heartbeat. In that moment, the crane felt less like a machine and more like a locked room waiting to be opened. By evening, they had decided to rest before tackling it properly with tools and light. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The clouds broke apart, revealing the pale sky over the yard. Andy stepped out and looked at the crane silhouetted against the horizon. The world around him was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic from the highway. Somewhere deep inside, hope began to stir again. not the kind born from profit or contracts, but from purpose. He didn't know why, but he felt that fixing this machine would change everything. When he closed the workshop for the night, he took one last look through the crack of the door. The crane stood motionless, streaked with rust and rainwater, its boom casting a long shadow across the ground. On the metal surface near the cabin, the light caught a thin line of silver where the paint had peeled, glinting faintly like a scar. Andy switched off the lights and walked out into the night. The engine would wait, silent and patient, until morning. The brothers drove home in silence, the road slick beneath their tires. Ray finally broke the quiet. "Even if we get it running, who's going to hire us? No one's building anymore." Andy kept his eyes on the road. "Then we'll build something else." "Out of what?" "Out of whatever's left." Ray didn't reply, but as they passed the dark outlines of half-finished buildings they once constructed, even he felt something shift, an old instinct returning, a stubborn refusal to quit. Back at the house, Andy placed his notebook on the kitchen table beside the keys to the crane. The note stared back at him like a map without a legend. He thought of all the things they had lost, their employees, their reputation, their future, and how sometimes the only way to start again was to dig through the wreckage. Maybe that was what tomorrow would bring. Maybe in the heart of an old machine, beneath layers of steel and grime, there was still something worth finding. When dawn crept through the blinds the next morning, the workshop awaited them in silence. The puddles outside had frozen overnight, and the first light turned them to mirrors. Andy could see his reflection as he unlocked the door. Tired, older than he remembered, but still alive with the stubborn will that had built everything from nothing once before. Inside, the smell of oil greeted him like an old friend. The crane loomed in the dimness, waiting. He felt the same quiet determination that used to come before every new project, that sense that beneath the rust lay potential. He picked up the wrench, wiped it clean, and set it on the workbench. Tomorrow they would open the side panel. Tomorrow they would look inside the machine's heart. For now, he let his hand rest on the cold metal, feeling the faint pulse of the world through steel. Somewhere within that sleeping engine, he sensed the first tremor of change, the beginning of a story buried in iron, waiting to be unearthed. Morning broke over the yard with a dull, metallic light, the kind that flattened color and made every surface look older than it was. The air hung heavy with the smell of oil and rain-soaked dirt. Andy unlocked the hangar and pushed the doors open, letting the gray daylight spill in across the cold concrete floor. The crane stood where they had left it, hulking and silent, its faded yellow paint streaked with rust. In the stillness, it looked less like a machine, and more like a monument to some forgotten era. Dust drifted down through the light from the rafters, settling on the boom and the thick tires. Ray arrived a few minutes later, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, his breath showing in the chill. They didn't speak for a while. The sound of the coffee machine at the gas station still clung to Ray's jacket, mixed with diesel and smoke. Andy took his cup and sipped without tasting it. His eyes were fixed on the side of the crane, where the paint color shifted slightly under the cabin. He could still see the outline of the bolts that didn't match, the dull gleam of metal that had no right to look that clean after 40 years. They started with the usual checks, almost by habit: hydraulic lines, brakes, electricals. The mundane rhythm of work steadied their hands but not their thoughts. Andy found himself glancing back at the same spot again and again. Finally, he set his wrench down. "Let's open it," he said. Ray looked up from the tangle of hoses and frowned. "The panel? You think it matters?" Andy nodded. "Something's off. Those welds aren't original." Ray sighed, but didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that his brother's instincts were rarely wrong when it came to machines. The bolts came free more easily than expected, another small wrongness that made Andy's stomach tighten. As the last one fell into his palm, he pulled the steel sheet away from the frame. A puff of stale air escaped, carrying with it the scent of burnt oil and something older metal sealed away for too long. The panel dropped to the ground with a clang that echoed in the hangar. Behind it, the engine loomed like a heart encased in armor. 6 massive cylinders rose from a block of grease-blackened steel, pipes looping like veins. Andy wiped a section clean with a rag. His fingers came away slick, but the surface underneath was smooth, almost polished. He traced the line of the weld, a perfect silver scar running horizontally across the side of the crankcase. It was too neat, too recent. The rest of the metal bore the wear of decades pitted, stained, dented, but the weld shimmered faintly, untouched by time. Andy leaned closer. "See that?" he said quietly. Ray crouched beside him, flashlight beam dancing over the metal. "It's fresh," Andy murmured. "Someone's been inside this engine. Not years ago, maybe months." Ray's brow furrowed. "Why the hell would anyone open a 40-year-old motor? There's nothing in here worth that kind of effort." Andy tapped the spot with the handle of his wrench. The sound that came back wasn't the hollow ring of steel, but a dull, solid thud. His eyes met Ray's. They both heard it. "That's not empty space," Andy said. He hit it again, harder this time. The same muted sound. Something was behind that weld. They spent the next hour setting up lamps and moving their tools closer. The air in the hangar grew warmer as the cutting torch hissed to life. Andy worked carefully, guiding the flame along the edge of the weld. Sparks rained down, sizzling when they hit the oily floor. The acrid smell of burning grease filled the air. Ray stood close by, ready with a pry bar. The cut metal glowed red, then dimmed. Andy shut off the torch and motioned for him to help. Together, they pried at the seam until a section of the plate bent outward with a screech. Behind it was a second wall of metal, smoother and thinner, like an inner lining. Andy felt a chill run through him. "This was built to hide something," he whispered. They cut again, smaller this time, making a square just large enough to reach inside. The steel flap peeled back like a lid. Inside, the cavity was dry and lined with some kind of fabric-heavy canvas, darkened with age. Andy reached in and pulled gently. The fabric moved, and beneath it something solid shifted. His hand brushed wood. He froze. "Ray," he said, voice low. "There's a box in here." It took both of them to pull it free. The box was rectangular, roughly 2 feet long, sealed with corroded clasps. Its surface was stained with oil, but the construction was careful, deliberate. Ray set it on the floor while Andy fetched a crowbar. They exchanged a look, half disbelief, half fear, and then Andy pried the lid open. The hinges creaked, and the smell that came out was dry, dusty, old. Inside, layers of cloth were folded neatly over something heavy. Andy peeled one back, and the dull yellow of metal caught the light. He reached in, his hand trembling, and lifted a small bar, dense and cold. A faded stamp marked its surface. U.S. Mint 1978. Ray swore under his breath. Andy stared at the gold bar, the weight of it anchoring his thoughts. Beneath the cloth, more bars gleamed faintly in the lamplight, stacked in careful rows. At one end of the box lay a bundle of papers tied with twine, edges browned with age. Andy set the gold down and untied the string. The papers were official documents-typed forms, bearing seals and signatures. Across the top of one page he read, United States Department of Industry, confidential. Another bore the name Harold K. Dawson. He turned a page and felt his throat tighten. It was a financial statement. Millions of dollars in project material allocations, signed and approved, but never delivered. There were references to construction contracts, coded shipments, storage yards. Ray flipped through another bundle and found receipts for transported metal units, all stamped as completed. "This is government stuff," he said. "Classified." Andy nodded slowly. Dawson Construction, that's the company name on the cab. They sat on the floor, surrounded by the relics of another century. The hangar felt smaller, as though the air itself had thickened around them. Andy could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the metal walls. "We need to think," he said. "If this is stolen property, if it's government." "We sell it," Ray interrupted, his voice sharp. "We finally catch a break, Andy. No one needs to know where it came from." "That's not an option." "Why not? You think anyone's looking for this after 40 years? It's junk, buried and forgotten." Andy didn't answer. He stared at the gold, the papers, the faint typewriter font marking the line between discovery and crime. The torch hissed quietly as it cooled beside them, the only sound in the silence. "Someone hid this for a reason," he said at last. "Not just to steal, to erase something." Ray shook his head. "You're overthinking it. It's money, that's all. And God knows we need it." The argument didn't last long. The exhaustion in their voices replaced the anger. They boxed everything up again, wrapping the contents in the same canvas they'd found. Andy resealed the opening with temporary bolts, just enough to make it look untouched. As he worked, he caught his reflection in the crane's window, a man covered in grease and sweat, yet different now, changed by what he had seen. That night, back at the house, neither could eat. The gold lay between them in their minds, glowing even in the dark. Ray paced the living room, muttering about debts and second chances. Andy sat by the window, the documents spread across his knees. The signatures and seals seemed to pulse under the lamplight, whispering stories of men who had thought they could bury truth under steel. He found one note clipped to a report. Project Horizon. Terminate pending investigation. The date was from the late 70s. The name Harold K. Dawson appeared again and again, sometimes with the title Chief Engineer. The words blurred as fatigue set in, but the thought remained sharp. If Dawson Construction had hidden this, then someone had meant it never to be found. Andy imagined the man sealing the box, welding the plate, walking away knowing that his secret would sleep inside a dead machine. For decades it had. Until now. At dawn, Andy returned to the workshop alone. The hangar was cold and still, the light pale and uncertain. He stood before the crane, touching the metal as if it could answer him. The air seemed charged, as though the past lingered there, pressing through time. He opened the notebook on the workbench and wrote in large, deliberate letters, "Find truth before it finds you." When Ray arrived, he looked like he hadn't slept either. "You still planning to call someone?" he asked. Andy nodded. "We have to. This isn't ours to keep." Ray exhaled, long and hard, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're going to get us dragged into something we don't understand." "Maybe," Andy said, "but it's already dragged us in." They spent the morning documenting everything, photographing the weld, the box, the papers. The sound of the camera shutter echoed in the empty space like a heartbeat. By noon, they had sealed the panel again, hiding the evidence inside the machine's core. It was safer that way, for now. As evening fell, they sat outside the hangar, watching the sun dip behind the line of trees. The light turned the crane's metal skin to bronze, soft and unreal. Ray broke the silence. "You really think this could matter? After all these years?" Andy didn't look away from the machine. "If it didn't, no one would have gone to so much trouble to hide it." The last of the light faded, and the workshop sank into shadow. The brothers stood and went inside, the echo of their footsteps following them. Behind them, the crane waited, silent once more, its engine holding the weight of both history and temptation. Somewhere deep in the cold heart of that steel, secrets older than either of them slept, waiting to be unearthed again. The following morning began with an uneasy silence. The air around the workshop was heavy, as if it carried the weight of something unspoken. Andy arrived first and found the hangar exactly as they had left it, the crane standing in still defiance, the seams of the welded panel dull under the pale light. He stood there for a long time, his breath visible in the cold, thinking about what they had done the day before. The gold, the documents, the revelation. They had all been too real to dismiss as a dream, yet too impossible to belong to the life he knew. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the clean weld and the box inside the engine, as if the machine itself had a heartbeat that would not stop echoing in his head. Ray arrived a little later, the sound of his truck tires crunching over gravel pulling Andy out of his thoughts. He stepped out, rubbing his eyes, holding 2 cups of coffee. He looked different, more tired, more guarded, the kind of look that comes when a man realizes he's standing between salvation and ruin. "So," Ray said, handing Andy a cup, "what's the plan now? Call the feds and hand over the only good thing that's happened to us in 5 years?" Andy didn't answer right away. He was looking at the crane again, its surface dotted with droplets of condensation. "We don't have a choice," he said finally. "We do have a choice," Ray snapped. "You just don't like mine." The argument that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Andy spoke of legality, of the risk of being caught, of moral obligation. Ray spoke of debt, of desperation, of survival. "You think the world ever gave a damn about rules?" he said. "We played by them, and look what it got us. Empty accounts, lost jobs, nothing left." Andy met his eyes calmly. "And what would it make us if we stole what doesn't belong to us?" Ray laughed bitterly. "You really think anyone's coming for that gold? It's been sitting there 40 years, Andy. The man who hid it's probably dust. We could fix the business, pay off the bank, start again. We can start again without stealing." "Without stealing?" Ray scoffed. "You call this living?" Andy didn't reply. The tension between them felt like a wire pulled to breaking. In the end, they both fell silent. The coffee turned cold in their hands. Andy went inside, sat at the workbench, and opened his notebook again. On the first page, under the words he had written the previous morning, he added another line. "If truth is buried, it grows sharper under the ground." He knew Ray was right about one thing. What they had found could change their lives. But he also knew that kind of change could rot a man from the inside out. They worked without speaking for most of the day, replacing bolts, draining old hydraulic fluid, and pretending that the crane was just another piece of equipment, not a secret wrapped in steel. By late afternoon, the clouds had gathered again. Andy was checking the oil pressure when he heard the distant crunch of gravel outside. A black pickup truck rolled slowly through the gate, stopping near the hangar. The windows were tinted. 2 men stepped out. They weren't dressed like mechanics or inspectors. Their clothes were too clean, their boots too polished. One of them, tall with gray hair, smiled as he approached. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he said pleasantly. "We're here about that Grove RT-58. Belonged to Dawson Construction. You must have bought it at auction." Ray came out from behind the crane, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's right," he said cautiously. "Everything's legal. We've got the papers." The gray-haired man nodded. "I'm sure you do. Still, that machine has some history attached to it. My company has a vested interest in ensuring it's handled properly." Andy stepped forward. "Your company?" "Let's just say we represent certain parties who'd prefer to recover property that was misplaced decades ago." The man's eyes flicked toward the crane for just a moment, then back to Andy. "We'll make it worth your while if you cooperate." Andy's stomach turned. There was something too measured in the man's tone, too controlled. He glanced at Ray, who looked pale but said nothing. "We don't sell equipment without proper documentation," Andy said carefully. "If there's an issue, you can take it up with the auction board." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I think we both know this isn't about paperwork." He stepped closer. "I'll give you my number. Think it over. But I'd advise against opening anything you can't close." They watched the truck leave, the sound of its tires fading into the distance. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Ray broke the silence first. "They know, Andy. They know what's in there." Andy nodded slowly. "That's why we need to act fast." That night, for the first time, fear outweighed curiosity. The hangar doors were locked and double-bolted, but Andy still found himself staring out the window, half expecting to see headlights in the dark. He called an old acquaintance the next morning, a lawyer who had worked with them during the days when contracts still came easily. His name was Tom Kendall, a man who had once represented government contractors. Andy explained everything, from the auction to the discovery. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Andy," the lawyer said finally, "if what you're saying is true, you're sitting on evidence from a federal investigation that was buried 40 years ago. You need to call the Department of Industry. Don't move the material, don't touch anything else, and definitely don't sell it." By the next afternoon, a convoy of government vehicles pulled into the yard. The agents moved with quiet precision, their expressions unreadable. They cordoned off the area around the crane, set up floodlights, and began photographing every inch of the machine. Ray stood outside the hangar, smoking furiously, while Andy watched from a distance. It felt surreal to see their small workshop filled with men in suits and uniforms. An older agent introduced himself as Robert Mayfield, a representative of the Federal Department of Industry and Historical Assets. He shook Andy's hand with a firm grip. "You did the right thing," he said. "This case has been cold for decades." The agents worked into the night, carefully cutting open the same weld Andy had discovered. They used specialized equipment, documenting every step. When the steel flap came away, the box inside was revealed again, untouched since the brothers resealed it. The gold bars gleamed under the bright lights, the stamped words clear even after all those years. The agents murmured among themselves as they lifted each piece, photographing, labeling, recording serial numbers. Then came the papers, still intact, still bearing official seals. One of the analysts unfolded them and let out a low whistle. "Project Horizon," he said. "I can't believe this is real." Agent Mayfield approached Andy and Ray. "These documents confirm a missing fund transfer from 1978, he explained. Millions in materials meant for infrastructure contracts that never materialized. The man behind it, Harold Dawson, vanished before he could be indicted. Until now, no one knew where the money went." Ray exhaled slowly. "And now you do. Now we do," the agent said. "And because you found it legally, you'll be compensated. The law allows for recovery rewards in cases like this." It should have felt like relief, but Andy sensed another layer beneath Mayfield's calm professionalism. There were too many agents, too much security. Something else was at stake. He found out why the next day. During the final inventory, one of the analysts opened a small, sealed envelope that had been taped inside Dawson's ledger. Inside was a letter, yellowed and fragile. The handwriting was neat and deliberate. It was addressed to someone named Richard Dawson Harold's younger brother. The letter revealed the true reason the engineer had hidden the gold. Harold had discovered that part of the funds were being diverted, not by him, but by a powerful criminal financier known only by the alias The Anchor. According to the letter, The anchor had hidden his own stolen assets inside the very same crane, specifically within the hollowed section of the main engine block, and had installed a small explosive device to ensure no one would ever dismantle it. Andy felt his blood run cold as Mayfield read the letter aloud. The room went still. The crane was no longer just a container of stolen gold. It was potentially a bomb. The agent ordered everyone out of the hangar except the bomb disposal team. The following hours stretched into a blur of tension. Technicians in protective suits swarmed around the crane, scanning it, cutting small access points, feeding cameras inside the engine. Andy and Ray waited outside the cordoned perimeter, the cold air biting through their jackets. Every now and then, someone shouted instructions or called for silence. By dawn, the news came. The mechanism had been found and neutralized. Hidden deep within the crankcase was a compact explosive, long inactive but still intact. The team extracted it, and, along with it, another sealed cavity filled with hundreds of untraceable bearer bonds. The experts estimated their combined value at over $9 million. It was the final piece of a puzzle that had haunted both government and international investigators for half a century: the stolen European bond shipment of 1938. Somehow, the anchor had merged his illicit wealth with Dawson's corruption, burying both crimes in one machine. When the agents confirmed it was safe to re-enter, Andy and Ray stepped back inside. The engine was opened like the chest of a giant, the empty cavity exposed to the light. The air smelled of dust and old fuel. The secret was gone, but the space it left behind felt immense. Mayfield approached them again, his tone softer now. "You two did more than return government property," he said. "You solved 2 historical cases in one stroke. The department will see that you're fairly rewarded. $6.5 million, to be exact, after all legal adjustments. You'll receive formal notice within the month." Ray stared at him, unable to speak. Andy simply nodded, though he barely understood the number. $6.5 million more than they could have earned in a lifetime of construction. Yet as the agents packed their equipment and the floodlights dimmed, neither of them felt triumphant. What they had uncovered wasn't just treasure. It was the weight of every choice made by men who thought they could outsmart time. Weeks passed. The investigation concluded. The hangar returned to silence. The crane was no longer evidence, but history. Andy had kept one part of it, the section of the engine they had first cut open. It stood now in the center of their office, mounted on a steel base, the silver line of the weld gleaming faintly under soft light. A plaque beneath it read, "Found inside a Grove, RT-58, Ohio, 2025. The truth was buried in steel. Their company changed with the seasons that followed. With their newfound funds, the Harper brothers reopened under a new name, Harper Restoration and Recovery. They no longer built skyscrapers or bridges. Instead, they specialized in restoring historical machinery, each piece carrying a story that might have otherwise been lost. Ray found peace in the rhythm of engines again, the kind of work that didn't demand more than honesty and craft. Andy kept the ledger from Dawson's files locked away in a drawer, a reminder that even good men could be trapped by greed. Sometimes, late in the evening, Andy would sit in the quiet of the office and look at the engine block. The scratches, the welds, the faint imprint of their fingerprints still marked the metal. He would think about the night they first found the box, about Ray's anger, his own fear, the temptation that could have ruined them both. He realized that every man meets a moment when the choice between right and wrong is not about law, but about who he wants to be when the lights go out. The gold was gone, the bonds secured in evidence, the secrets of Dawson and the anchor written into history books. But for Andy, the real treasure was simpler, the knowledge that they had survived their own test, that they had chosen integrity over desperation. When he looked at the gleam of the steel under the lamplight, he didn't see loss. He saw proof that even in rust and ruin, something honest could still shine. Outside, the yard was quiet again. The rain had returned, pattering softly on the roof of the hangar. The sound was no longer a reminder of decay, but of renewal. The world had turned, and they had turned with it. The crane that once carried corruption now carried memory, and in that memory, the brothers found peace. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't miss the next video, and check out the others on the channel. Share this one with someone who loves a good story.